Everyone, this is a bit of business, and on behalf of learmedia.tv and the British and Irish Trading Alliance, welcome to the show. My name is John FitzGerald. Our special guests today are Mark Richardson and Dan Marsden. Gentlemen, you're welcome to the show. Just by way of introduction, Mark is currently the Director of Delivery at U&I, who are specialists in creating mixed-use regeneration developments, and he oversees the senior strategic leadership for the delivery of U&I's regeneration portfolio. Before joining U&I 5 years ago, Mark was pre-construction director at Lang O'Rourke, and he has worked on some of the capital's most recognizable buildings, including One Hyde Park, the Francis Crick Institute, and Leadenhall. Dan Marsden is the business development director at Searchflow, and they provide the due diligence, compliance, and risk mitigating intelligence to law firms involved in the design and build of new developments and the selling and leasing of land and property. Before that, Dan spent many years working in the construction sector in business development, and also as an investor and as a developer himself. So welcome to you both. Gents, our theme today is technology and construction, and this is a subject that you're both well versed in, so let's get started. And there's several areas I want to cover off today, guys. I want to look in the rearview mirror a little bit over the last 20 years to just get your perspective and understand historically what's happened in the construction sector when it comes to technology and innovation in general. I then want to look at the last 18 months to get your perspectives on the role that technology has played, essentially in keeping the sector going during a global pandemic. And then I want to look ahead to the next 5 to 10 years and get your thoughts on where you expect the sector to be tech-wise and what we can expect to see in the future in your own companies, but also in the industry more generally. So let me start with this question with you, Mark, and then on to Dan. So looking backwards in time, I think it's fair to say, relative to other sectors, that the construction industry in general has been slow to embrace technology in the last 20 years. Why has that been the case, Mark?
I think you've got to sort of divide the technologies into different areas. So in terms of product technology, I think the industry is ultra conservative. You've got to, certainly in the UK, get agreement certification, which is quite a long process, and various other independent certifications against an ever-changing sort of policy background. So it's actually, when it comes to products, really hard to get a new product to the market. But I do think there's some really, really exciting new products that are coming to the market or will be shortly. So it's no excuse, but it's disappointing, but that's just the way our industry is, and the ultra safe conservatism involved around fire and structural integrity, and the many, many different stakeholders who have got to be satisfied before you can incorporate those products into a building. When it comes to software technology, I think that's a different story. I began life as an engineer 40 odd years ago, and the advancements in things, the dumpy level and the theodolite are now replaced by total stations. Well, there's an advancement even on the total station, which uses GPS technologies, and a big challenge when I was an engineer was you needed the sight lines, and often that wasn't quite possible to see through. Where now you don't need any of that. So the speed at which you can set things out accurately is incredible. The software that's evolving in design, technically authored objects that then go into BIM models. All of those things are incredibly exciting. And I think as we look now at things like wellness in buildings, the ability to use an app on your phone to establish whether or not it's safe to open the window beside you in an office, that's the sort of next stage. But yeah, I mean, it's slow, it's painful, and in my 42 years in the industry, it's a sad thing to say that it's one of the few industries where productivity has, if anything, decreased during that period. But that's mainly around the way in which we train and employ our workforce more than anything else.
And Dan, same question to you, but before you answer, there was an interesting quote online from designbuildnetwork.com, an article over the summer. And there was a quote in there that struck me, and I'm just wondering if this is part of the answer to this question. And the quote is, among the challenges for companies in the construction industry when it comes to investing in new technology is that they find there are limited financial gains in the short term, and this makes it difficult to justify making financial commitments when operating margins are tight. Does that go to, to some extent explain the situation over the last 20 years? What are your thoughts?
Not really. And I think, to be honest, I think I'd echo what Mark said. I mean, I had a look this morning, but last year, the construction sector contributed about £117 billion to the UK economy. Okay, it's about 6% of the total economic output of this country, 2.5 million jobs, and that's about 7% of all jobs in the UK, 13% of all UK businesses. And putting that into perspective, the construction sector is about 6 times larger than the automotive industry. Obviously, we were talking about cars earlier. You think about cars and construction, who would you expect to be ahead technologically? Your gut would say cars, just because of the moving parts. But actually, when you think about the moving parts on a construction site or the sort of projects that Mark's involved with, it's far more hazardous than just driving a car. Actually, a building that goes catastrophically wrong is a far bigger danger than a car. But again, I'd say, I think you've got this clash of mentalities of traditional building techniques and, not a point blank refusal to adopt new technology, but a reluctance to allow it to encroach on what has been a very traditional industry. It hasn't moved, apart from maybe materials, and obviously this is very general, but people say the construction industry hasn't moved that fast since the Romans and the Victorians. Of course it has, in terms of efficiencies and speed and product technology and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, I think you've got an industry that has always seemed ripe for tech innovation. But it's like the legal industry I'm working in now. It's a very hard industry to disrupt, because it's changing the status quo sometimes is far more scary than just doing what you've always done, because it works, even though it might not be as efficient and it might not be as safe. And at the end of the day, a lot of these things, in terms of financial risk and exposure to a market, that's always a scary thing. What happens if we adopt this new technology and it goes wrong? Actually, we've got this thing funded and we've got more time and we've got problems with manpower and all this sort of thing. So I don't think it's fair either to say that most companies don't have this, because companies like you and I, and I've worked with house builders and developers who have invested heavily in R&D in their technical departments. Their teams are expanding all the time. So I think it's like the bigger law firms. If you've got a Magic Circle law firm, they have tons of people invested in R&D and legal technology, but the rest, and we're talking about the majority, are falling behind still, despite some of the bigger house builders in this country, people like Berkeley and Barratt, investing heavily in maybe modular construction, whereas a large part of their construction now is heading that way. But I think there is still a heavy resistance. And look, in the past, look what happened to, when Netflix and Spotify came along. You had companies went bust almost overnight, because it's this whole innovate or die approach. And if the construction industry, I think, doesn't catch up quickly, obviously there's loads of different things that affects Mark's job in delivery. You've got manpower, you've got product, you've got all these moving parts. You compare this to a car. There are so many moving parts in any construction site. Certainly the size of the schemes that are being delivered today. We're not looking at 30 flats on a high street. You know, we're talking about thousands of units being delivered, and I don't know how many trades on your average site nowadays. What, 700 to 1,000 trades on a site? I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, and just on that, Dan, I mean, one of the biggest challenges for the industry is back in Victorian times, there were 9 trades, and you know, you could become a master bricklayer and master carpenter. Today, as a result of that range of different components and products and approaches, you're talking of about 170 different specialist trades, where previously there were a maximum of 9.
Right.
And there aren't the apprenticeships for each of those 170, unfortunately. So it is becoming more moving parts and even more challenging and more difficult.
And Dan, when you look back over the last, let's say, 10 years, when tech innovation has actually happened in this sector, where has it happened, and has it stuck, and has it had a ripple effect to, you know, influence other house builders or developers in the sector to run with that technology, or has it sort of peaked and then dropped off again?
No, well, I'll leave the pure construction side to Mark, obviously, as the expert, but I can speak with some authority on the sales side of things, you know, disposing, marketing of schemes. You know, you look at how house builders did. When I first started working from a porter cabin with Berkeley Homes back in 1996, I think it was, you know, with a few tile samples and a and a brochure that had been printed, you know, on 6 pages. That was at the time how we sold houses and flats, you know, and then we evolved into these marketing suites. And now you walk into a marketing suite and you've got VR, you've got you know, all these different things, augmented reality schemes. You can look at a mobile phone and see a building popping up, whereas at the moment you've got a cleared site. I mean, it's insane, the ability to which we can dispose of these units, and because obviously there's no market. If you're building all this stuff, you can't sell it or lease it, and it's kind of a pointless exercise in terms of, you know, financially. Obviously, there's the bigger picture of providing homes and employment for people, of course, but the means by which we've disposed of these schemes over the last 20 years has evolved to such a point now where, you know, most people, if you were to transport somebody from 1996 to 2021 to a marketing suite, I mean, it would be like somebody from the Victorian age who's been used to driving a steam tractor stepping into a 20-ton excavator. They wouldn't know what the hell was going on. So I think in terms of tech, it's had an enormous effect. And when you look at what COVID's done to the industry and the fact that sales volumes have been not only maintained, but I mean, it's been insane with the SDLT holiday and everything else that's happened. And, you know, and this has never stopped, last 25 plus years, you know, international investors investing in the UK property, particularly London and some of the larger cities. That's all been done remotely. It's all been done remotely using 3D printed technology models. It's been done using VR and AI and all these different things, and, you know, electronic brochures and all of this stuff was sort of, you know, you'd have looked at this as some sort of futuristic program, say this is how we're going to sell property in the next, you know, in 20 years time. That's how it's going to happen. And I think, you know, to a large extent, I mean, there are lots of things. I was having a good look actually last couple of days at the sorts of things that, you know, are reflective. Again, I say draw a parallel with the legal industry where adoption to change is just as slow as it is in the construction industry to a large degree, although there's investment in teams to bring this up to speed. And I think you have to look at other industries, and we always did. When we were selling property, we always, well, how does a hotel group present itself? How do the very best car producers present themselves? And I think you have to keep looking at that. But it's unrecognizable now, even 10 years ago. Although I do still seem to find the same sort of, you know, wicker balls in a show flat that I was seeing 20 years ago. But it's come so far, it's ludicrous. You know, the presentation of these developments and the ability to sell them has been made so much easier directly as a result of the adoption of technology. I suspect there's not much different on the sort of schemes that Mark's working on.
Mark, would you agree with that?
I would. Throughout the pandemic, our sales rate, we've got quite a lot of residential developments which were private for sale. We've been able to have virtual viewings in every one of those apartments. We made a decision about 4 years ago as a company, as well as investing in land for development, we would invest in prop tech. And one of the technologies we invested in was Matterport, which is the software that you go into a space and it creates a full three-dimensional walkthrough visualization in a matter of minutes. We've also been using a piece of software technology that manages the conveyancing process, and the potential purchasers can track progress on an app. These are things that were unheard of. Back to the bit though that you wanted my expertise, being a chartered builder, about product improvements that I've seen over, say, the last 20 years. Well, in terms of residential development, believe it or not, 20 years ago, it was still timber stud partitions and plasterboard that was anything but moisture resistant. Today, you know, the use of a lightweight steel to create FSS and moisture resistant plasterboards, cementitious products, the use of those products. Pipework systems, everything was copper, everything was manual or compression joints, capillary joints. Today it's various forms of polymers with plug fit. And I look back to its initial introduction 20 years ago into hospitals, and the strength of resistance to adopting those products, despite it, the potential to save the NHS tens of millions, was just unbelievable. But those are sort of simple things to improve productivity. I think the next big areas of technological gain is where products are modified to reduce the amount of carbon. So we are currently trialing first commercial use of a product, albeit it has to be in a temporary situation because of the way certification works, of graphene in concrete. That graphene will transform the entire industry. So we poured our first slab last week. It achieved its 28 kilonewtons in 24 hours. For those unfamiliar with these things, you'd be lucky if you got to about 7 to 10 kilonewtons. And you could be at 28 in 14 days. What it will mean is that you can remove cement from concrete, and it's cement that creates the CO2 and therefore the carbon. And you can also remove quite a lot of the reinforcement. So that one innovation, the incorporation of graphene in concrete, is going to change the global perception of concrete and the reduction in carbon. So we hope as an industry, and certainly as a company, we're hopefully at the forefront of that. It's really exciting. There's a lot of universities, a lot of people involved in that. So there's an example of what I see as a really big breakthrough for the whole of the industry.
That's a disruptive innovation and introduction.
Really disruptive, yeah.
Yeah. And Dan, just let's move now to the last 18 months, because let's be honest, I think it's been quite impressive what the construction industry has done, not only in the UK and in Ireland, but also, you know, globally, to try and stay upright and keep moving during the pandemic and find ways to operate effectively despite what was going on. What's impressed you the most when you think about tech and how that has enabled the sector to keep going? And what are your reflections on that?
I think what we're doing now is a reflection of where we've been the last 18 months, 2 years. It's the ability to work remotely. In our company, certainly at Searchflow, there was a survey done a few months ago about where people would like to work, given the choice. And a lot of the functions in the business now are able to work remotely from home, to go into the office if they wish. We can organise to go in and do work. Not so easy on a construction site, obviously, where things have to be done. I mean, there's some functions you can't do, but I think the world's ability to adapt has been quite impressive, to be honest. I think it's like one of those things you think, goodness, business is going to suffer. I think it's become fairly obvious that those.
We've lost Dan for a second. You're back again.
Back in the room. Yeah, I think. Okay. I think supply relationships have been tested. I think the robustness of the supply chain, and that's been very difficult. And I think in terms of financially, a lot of businesses have been through a really tough time, and just staying alive, to be honest. Others have, I would go so far as to say, they've flourished. They've saved money. They've changed the workplace, and our thoughts around where we can and should and can work to keep a business profitable has changed immensely. I mean, looking just at where we are at Searchflow, we're doing better than we were when I think we were in the office. I think people have found a way to work really efficiently. And at the end of the day, this discussion around tech, it is about efficiency and reduction of cost. And obviously, a reduction in cost is a byproduct of efficiency, but it's become fairly evident that some people have really flourished. I think the one thing we've got to be mindful of, I think certainly with the construction industry as a whole, and Mark's mentioned it, mental health is a massive consideration in the industry, given the terrible stats in the industry. But I think it's been really important to recognise some of the good that's come out of what's happened in the last 18 months. And I think our ability to adapt to a really difficult situation, but leaning on tech as we're doing now, these meetings have eliminated, I don't know how many millions of hours of wasted journey time. I'm able to have several meetings in a day without leaving the study. And I missed face-to-face meetings. And I think, in an industry that's always been, we talk about the traditional sort of construction industry. I've been in and around construction for the last 20 plus years, and I think that face-to-face element has always been really important. It is a relationship-based industry, the construction industry, and even the wider property industry. It's always been a face-to-face industry. So getting back to that sort of situation where we can do that, I think is going to be great. But I think we have to give ourselves a massive pat on the back. The last 18 months have been very, very difficult for lots of different reasons, for lots of different people, but I think we've managed to cope. And I think, the fact that the construction industry was one of the first to come back and was allowed to keep going, I think just shows the importance of the construction industry to the government, certainly who recognised the fact that we had to keep building houses and offices. I think it's just a case of credit where it's due. I think we've done really well to keep things going, and there've been lots of cases where people have not managed, but there's lots of success stories coming out the last 18 months as well.
And Mark, in the context of you and I, and also some of your peers in the industry, it seems as if the pandemic has forced companies to innovate and leverage technology and switch on things like remote working overnight, etc. So it's sort of adopt or sort of crash and burn to some extent. And have you seen this period as almost like a springboard for technology and innovation moving forward, because people realize, wow, we can actually innovate, we can adapt new tech quickly, and we've just done it and demonstrated that it can be done. So that historic conservative approach is perhaps been challenged in the last 18 months because people have been able to actually do it. What are your thoughts?
I think the retail industry, which has seen the disruption created by the likes of Amazon and the move to online, has really impacted many of the huge global developers, REITs, etc. What we're now starting to see is that it's not just high street retail. but it's probably every sector is sort of being reimagined. And I think the days of big corporate offices, be it government or private, are being reevaluated. There's the emergence now of the serviced office, which is much more like a hotel type operation where you take space, and companies that you would never have imagined taking serviced office, because at a headline level it's probably 3-4 times more expensive, but over a 5-year period and where you can't predict the future, it's probably cheaper. So we're seeing investment more in life sciences, research, technology type organizations, the creation of innovation hubs where you bring together young startup businesses who have a combination of either working from home or working in an environment where they're working alongside dozens of other people under memberships and share ideas. So the way people are starting to work and how they might work in the future is really challenging our industry. It's probably during the pandemic resulted in a sort of a hiatus. There was the schemes that were already in construction, and the industry has done absolutely brilliantly during the last 18 months. It's continued to deliver. We had projects as we went into the pandemic that were behind, and we finished them on time. It's some brilliant achievements. But in terms of new schemes, I think people have put on hold and are reflecting currently on what the future office, what the future residential scheme looks like. And I think what we all know is it doesn't look like what we've been delivering for the previous 15 years. And it will be technology enabled. Wellness will play a big part. I think it needs to be far more interesting space. It can't just be a bland, boring office next to 10 other bland, boring offices, because if it is, people will work from home because it'll be more interesting. It'll need to have amenity. So most offices that you go in now that are co-working serviced office space, they all have cafes, they have gyms, they have wellness areas, they have roof terraces, lots of breakout spaces. They don't look like an office, they look more like a 5-star hotel. That just happen to have desks instead of bedrooms. So I think for me, though, the one frustration over the last 18 months is while the private sector and our consultants and things had invested in the technology and could collaborate over Teams and Zoom, is we are entirely reliant on progress through partnership with the public sector, local authorities, planning committees, utilities companies. For whatever reason, none of those are as quick to invest. And we have really been hampered. Planning committees, it took 12 months before they even got around to having virtual planning committees. That's been our frustration. And, in days where you can send all of your bills electronically, the utility companies still insist in sending them on our development schemes, hard copy, by paper to empty apartments and refuse to change. So there are changes that are needed right across the board if we're all to succeed. And I would target my frustrations there at the utility companies, which hamper progress, and just how government spends its money, and often it should be leading the way on technology, and perhaps adopting, the likes of Microsoft rather than trying to create its own software each time.
And Dan, just coming to you, because we talked about carbon footprint earlier and the environment. ESG is becoming more and more relevant, not only for businesses, but also for consumers, because people are being more mindful of ESG and the environment and social impact, etc. And something like, I'm just going to pick one because I want to look ahead now for a few minutes, guys, to future innovations, and one which has been around for quite a while, but seems to be gathering some sort of momentum. This whole area of modern methods of construction and MMC. Dan, what are your thoughts on this? And will you, because of the pressure from either government or due to regulation, will you see the industry having to start to think about being more socially conscious and ESG conscious, with a green agenda coming and looming from all governments? Can you see a time where MMC will start to form a much bigger portion of how developments are created and put on the ground, compared to the traditional way of just sending a team into a field in the middle of winter to put brick on top of brick?
Yeah, I mean, I got a couple of things to say about this. I mean, I've had some dealings with some of the MMC guys, and there's a really great example given to me by one chap who said, look, if you're buying a new car, would you rather that car were built in a factory by engineers and signed off at however many different stages, very much like JCB do? You go to their factory, it's something else to watch. You watch these machines being put together. Would you rather your car was assembled in a factory with that kind of precision and signed off at however many different stages, or would you rather they dumped the bits of your car on your drive and built your car in the drive? I think the skill in the construction industry in this country in particular is something to behold, and there is something to be said for skilled trades. And I think the days, if that ever comes, where we lose that that traditional skill, will be a really, really sad day. But I think you've got to watch the big volume guys. I'm not that far away. We're in Kent. I'm not that far away from Berkeley Homes, modular mammoth of a factory over towards Gravesend. I think Barratt said a couple of days ago, Barratt Homes is looking to reduce its need for people to build houses by delivering more MMC because of skilled labour costs rising at the rate they are. There's certain things that never seem to go down. That's labour costs and build costs, right? So it doesn't matter what view you take on sales or what view you take on your margin at the end of the scheme. Those two things, I don't think, Mark, you ever remember a time when build costs went down. It doesn't happen very often. And skilled labour costs, and I do mean skilled labour costs, always seem to be on the rise. And they Barratt had said, and this is literally a few days ago, they were experiencing moderate inflationary pressure, and the cost of that skilled labour, is going up. And they said in the same sentence, I guess the positive is that that rise in labour costs was due to the overall strength of the industry's recovery over the last sort of 18 months. But they're looking purely at efficiency and reducing that demand on labour through the rollout of their house type ranges using MMC. And they're more and more. And if someone like Barratt, who's producing, I don't know how many houses they produce now every year, but it's significant. But they were saying of the 17,000 houses built in their latest financial year, I think 25% of them were built using MMC. So if somebody who's building the number of houses Barratt's building are doing it, I think, I'm not saying everybody follows, but these sizable guys do one thing, the industry pays attention. And I guess they're dealing in different volumes in terms of labour guys needed on site to a specialist developer who's turning out, a different kind of product. But I guess that's the thing with the adoption of tech as a whole. It's very difficult to say you've got to adopt these things for all sites, because all sites are different. You've got to deal with things like weather. You've got to deal with things like moving. You've got people moving around sites. So it's very difficult. But I think if you're not looking at what these large volume house builders are doing, it's a mistake. And I think if they're doing it, there's a reason they're doing it. And they've just pinned one of the things is efficiency and its labour costs. But I suspect there'll be lots of reasons for them building 25% of their volume, over the last sort of recent financial year. And that's because they're looking to save money. And maybe, you haven't got the snagging used to. I remember we used to have guys, oh my goodness, years ago, snagging was just, I don't know how many hours were spent snagging units at the end, almost as much as was spent building them. It's a massive time waster. And I think if you can get these things signed off in a factory with the kind of precision that a lot of these guys are saying they're getting, and there were lots of these guys at the moment in terms of, the percentage, in terms of how, I don't know what the percentage is now, MMC compared to the traditionally built houses and apartments, but it is on the rise, and it's on the rise because I think people are realizing there's not a better way of building houses and flats, but a different way that does help them with that sustainability, policy, I guess. And we're seeing it a lot in the legal sector, and in business as a whole, in the corporate world. A lot of the M&A activity that's happening globally right now, a lot of these big firms, and there are a few examples come out in the last few months, but in terms of mergers and acquisitions and just countries as a whole, countries now have a green, amber or red profile in terms of ESG. They're properly profiled. We do a profiling report ourselves, the Landmark Information Group. The guys there are heavily involved in ESG, and it is becoming a big deal now. And we've got what we call the magic circle of firms in London are all heavily investing in the ESG and sustainability issue, because it's to ignore it would be a mistake. And the
Mark,
same is happening here.
Is MMC an opportunity for the sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also going to be driven by policy. I think it's already a requirement, Dan, that the major house builders, and I don't know what the threshold is to qualify as a major house builder, but 25% of all new homes have to be delivered using MMC, which is often interpreted as being volumetric, boxes on wagons built in factories, but it can include the sort of SIPS type schemes. Recently, I've seen some quite promising advances in technology of pieces of equipment like 3D printing and CNC machines that are transportable to site. I don't think it's possible to build every typology of building in a factory. I think where it's 10,000 units plus, it becomes economical. But if it's a one-off, I still think it's likely to be far more economical to do that on site. However, that's no excuse for continuing to do it the way we do it. And I think if we can introduce equipment that can create these complex shapes and what have you, rather than rely on lots of bits of components sourced from all across the world, all put together, or believe they're all going to fit together in the rain on a windy day, 20 stories up. Why we continue to do that, nobody knows, but we do. And the detailing is becoming more and more complicated, as we all know, as we strive to get even better performance from our buildings. For me, it needs a big shake-up there, and we do need to have pieces of equipment that are transportable on our roads that can be brought to site, that replace people and use different ways of creating high performance structures. But the other part of it is just improvements in the design. If we're to reduce the amount of embodied carbon and produce the net zero, to get to net zero or zero carbon in use, there's a lot of things we're going to have to do around the design of our buildings. But there is some promising areas of development there. The UK government announced about 2 weeks ago their hydrogen strategy, and obviously replacing natural gas with hydrogen over time, and the two different types, the green gas from electrolysis, and there's the blue gas, which is strangely enough using natural gas to create hydrogen and then using carbon capture. Ultimately, though, the big breakthroughs are either, in technology terms, is the ability to use direct current to transfer electricity load over long distances, which would mean that we could have solar farms in the Sahara that then could feed the rest of the world. And I think they're getting fairly close. And the other, obviously, where although it's been going on since 1930, but I understand the science and while it can create, and that is fusion technology, recreating what the sun does, which is join two atoms together, and that creates huge amounts of energy, which requires obviously lots of knowledge, not just about fusion, but about plasma. So I think there'll be new energy sources in the future, and I think it's likely to be nuclear fusion rather than our current nuclear technology of splitting the atom. It will be joining atoms, which creates far more energy, and it will be cracking the whole thing of, instead of using alternating current, we can use a direct current, DC, to transmit far higher loads. I think there's going to be breakthroughs that currently none of us are talking about, but will have a massive impact on the future design of our buildings and what we do.
Well, this sort of answers my last question, Mark, but I'll ask it anyway and maybe go to Dan first. And I'm just, in no particular order, I'm thinking of future technology, and I'm thinking of BIM, robotics, AI, drones, MMC we've touched on, big data, the Internet of Things, 5G, Wi-Fi 6, augmented reality, 3D printing, blockchain, and so on and so on. Dan, what are you most excited about in the sector over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think Mark's touched on it a few times, and it's undefined at the moment because I haven't seen it, but I think it's going to be a product. I think it's going to be a product that's going to help us with all of those things. I think it's going to change the way the construction industry is in terms of waste, in terms of where it's produced, and if you can produce machines that can do this stuff on site. 3D printing is ridiculous, and I haven't seen the detail, but I've seen that Skanska now are doing some work on delivery of rail components and everything else with 3D printing, and I think it's going to be a product. I think Mark's spoken about the concrete. I think it's going to be something like that will be, and I hate the word disruptor because it's very rare. It actually there is, but that is a real disruptor. That concrete is ridiculous. It's going to be a product. And I think you mentioned big data. I read yesterday that over the last 2 years alone, 90% of data in the world has been generated. So I think, if you're producing that kind of data where you can uncover these sort of hidden trends, and Mark's just said it's hidden, there's going to be a hidden trend that will pop out of data. I think we'll be able to look at patterns in our behavior and make better decisions, as a whole. But I think for me, I'm always excited by new products. I always love seeing stuff across all industries. And I think in the construction industry, whether it's through MMC or whether it's through, someone like you and I discovering something amazing that is sort of, populated throughout the industry as a whole, I think for me, it's always going to be product innovation where I find I'm most excited, to be honest. So I think next sort of 5-10 years, you look at it 20 years ago, the sort of materials we're using now didn't really look much like what we were using 20 years ago even. But yeah, it's going to be a product that's going to come along in the next few years that's just going to blow everybody away. And I think that's always the exciting thing for me. It's the genius of people to find something new that just changes everything.
Anything to add to that, Mark?
I was just going to say, knowing this going out to the Irish market is obviously, you mentioned data. In real estate, the whole world of data centers, it's been the lifeblood and mainstay of the Irish construction industry, and it's here to stay. But I would say, I think in the longer term, it's definitely product and energy source related. And I'm really excited about the incorporation of graphene in concrete, as you can tell. I think, though, in the immediate term, I think 5G, the introduction of 5G, means a lot more to like a mixed-use developer like ourselves than we've initially thought. And 5G and the speed allows us to do power sharing. And what does that look like on one of our major schemes? So Mayfield in Manchester, a 1.4 billion mixed-use scheme. It means that instead of 18 megawatts of electricity being used annually, the 5G will reduce that by approximately half. So, and it's just the ability to turn on and off things without any of us realizing that that's been turned on and off in order to keep the loadings at a set level. So I think that's an exciting near-term technology.
Well, guys, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for your considered insights and opinions. I think the future is very, very bright for the construction industry. Despite the challenges, there is massive opportunity, and I think technology will have a massive part to play in keeping the sector as healthy and vibrant as it has been over the last 12 to 15 months. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been A Bit of Business. My name is John FitzGerald. Please do remember to visit the BITA website, bita.ie, for news about upcoming events and, of course, those famous construction lunches across the BITA chapters. That's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. All the best.
Thank you, John.